The January 6th committee is promising to reveal even more new information about the attack on the Capitol. At last night's hearing, members showed never-before-seen video of the riot. They also laid out what they learned about several Republican lawmakers' actions surrounding the insurrection. To give us some legal analysis of the case so far, I want to bring in David Becker. He is a CBS News election law contributor. He's also the executive director at the Center for Election Innovation and Research. David, so great to have you with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So let me ask you first, just your thoughts on the case as laid out by the committee thus far. And I know that they've said that there are going to be many more of these public hearings, but...
And the investigation is ongoing.
But what did you learn that you didn't know before? Because a lot of people are going to say that, right? I already know what happened. I saw the video. I get it. Why are they holding these hearings in prime time? What did you, as a lawyer, learn that you didn't know before?
Well, I think there is a few things that we learned for the first time. For instance, that sitting members of Congress beseeched the outgoing president for pardons in the days after January 6th and some other factors. But I think most importantly, what we're really seeing is the beginning of a case that's being laid out that is very factual and putting all of the facts in one place, and also, frankly, very emotional. It's hard not to be moved by the words of Representative Cheney and the video minute by minute we're seeing some now that shows the extreme violence, and the tweet by President Trump at 2:24 p.m. Threatening the vice president while there were ongoing chants of hang Mike Pence. The words of Officer Edwards about she and her colleagues and the threats they were facing and the violence they were facing, and seeing the other officers moved by that as they had to relive that moment. It's frankly chilling. We even hear for the first time from the president's own members of his cabinet, members of his campaign staff, and even members of his family admitting that they knew that the election wasn't stolen. In the words of Attorney General Barr, it was all BS. And I think that's something we're going to really look forward to in the coming weeks as the hearings continue, is one, a lot more documentation that shows what we already know, which was that the 2020 election was the most secure, transparent, and verified election in American history, with more paper ballots, more audits, more court confirmation of the results. And then secondly, I think tying President Trump himself to the insurrection, the attempted coup that occurred, culminated on January 6th.
So, David, let me just follow up on what you just said, because I thought it was absolutely fascinating. To me, the big detail that I don't feel has gotten a lot of coverage, and you just mentioned it, David, was revealed during Congresswoman Cheney's opening remarks, that a number of Republican congressmen had sought a pardon from former President Trump, right? And the fact that almost every official in former President Trump's orbit knew that the election was not fraudulent, was not rigged, including former President Trump, and yet they perpetrated this lie.
Well, he was told over and over again anyway.
Told over and over again that it was true, yet they perpetrate these lies to this day. There are members of the Republican Party who continue to perpetuate the notion that the 2020 election was fraudulent. So, can the President of the United States preemptively pardon an individual? Because I know that the law is kind of nebulous on this executive power that the commander-in-chief has. Can he preemptively issue pardons, and can he do them in secret? In other words, are there people in Congress or elsewhere, family members, for example, who have received pardons from the President of the United States that he doesn't have to divulge until the time is right?
It would sort of be like a Monopoly get-out-of-jail card that you just hang on
you hold
until
on
you
to
need
it until they call you up to stand before the committee. I don't know.
Yeah, there's this idea of pocket pardons that people can carry with them in secret for some time has been hypothetical and around there for some time. And the president's pardon power has always been viewed very widely, that it's something that's granted by the Constitution and is not subject to a lot of review. However, there are laws against obstruction of justice and exchange of things in exchange for crimes. And if it can be proven that a pardon was part of obstruction of justice and part of a quid pro quo in exchange for a crime being committed or covering up a crime, it's possible, and I think this is an open question in the law, that whether the pardon could be rescinded might be difficult, but whether the person who offered the pardon has committed a crime might be open for interpretation, might be something that could be prosecuted.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, when I listened to the opening statements, I thought to myself, these committees usually give you a list of recommendations, how to make sure this doesn't happen again. And this is being laid out like a criminal case, like the opening statements for a criminal case, which brings me to my question, which sort of includes what you brought up. Where is this going afterwards? It's not just about a list of recommendations, do you think?
No, I mean, I think there's a few audiences for this. Certainly the American people, reminding them of what we saw on January 6th. As we sit here today, we're 585 days since the November 3rd, 2020 election, and still there hasn't been a shred of evidence that would suggest that there was widespread fraud or any fraud sufficient to overturn the results of the election. But as you mentioned, there are still grifters out there, targeting the sincere disappointment of supporters of the former president to try to get rich and try to gain power. So I think the American people need to be reminded that this wasn't a tour. This wasn't a peaceful protest. This was an attack on the Capitol, attack on members of the police, an attack on members of Congress, an attack on all of us, in a sense, to prevent Congress from doing its official duty. I think another audience for this, obviously, is the Department of Justice. I think the Department of Justice may be engaged in some investigations as well, and some of this evidence may complement those investigations, and also other members of Congress. I mean, there are members of Congress to this day who are out there saying that this was no big deal, and apparently saying that even if a member of the other political party tried to do this, that would be okay. I have a hard time believing that anyone could actually believe that. There are even news organizations that are refusing to show these very, very important hearings. I think trying to get this out there is really important.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that, there are some who are suggesting, members of the Republican Party, other media personalities, that no one's watching this, no one cares. It doesn't matter, right? As you point out, David, it's not up to the committee to make people care about this.
Right.
They have just to do their duty and do the investigation. And then after that, it's up to the Justice Department. It's up to the people when they go to the ballot box. But as you know, CBS News has confirmed people close to the former vice president, that's Mike Pence, that he is set to testify during these hearings. Greg Jacob, Pence's lawyer, will speak to the committee, and so will a judge who advised Pence about his power to certify election results leading up to the attack on the Capitol. In any other time period that we were living in, when Representative Liz Cheney said that the President Trump, when he was told and shown images of the noose for the vice president, that people were chanting that they wanted to essentially lynch the vice president, Liz Cheney said, quote, "The president said Mike Pence deserves it." That's the quote that Congresswoman Cheney used in reaction to learning his supporters were calling to hang the vice president. Wouldn't that just be enough right there for the members of the cabinet to say there's an issue here that needs to be addressed?
Yeah. Can you imagine what Republicans would say if the party labels here were switched? I mean, this is something that is an attack on all of us as Americans. And as far as people watching, I mean, all the committee can do is lay the case out and let the American people decide for themselves. I'll just note that apparently the former president himself is watching, because he just put out a message on social media about what his daughter had said, acknowledging that the election wasn't stolen, in testimony that we saw for the first time last night. So I think what we're going to see is a bunch of experts over the course of the next few weeks, election experts, legal experts, people who had firsthand knowledge. You mentioned Judge Ludig, who is a great defender of the Constitution, one of the most noted conservative legal scholars in the country, a former federal judge who will testify. We're going to hear election officials, including Republican election officials from around the states, and hear from people who had firsthand knowledge of what was going on in the vice president's office and in the White House itself. And I think it's going to lay out a very compelling case, and we'll have to see where law enforcement takes it from there.
I know it's going to be tough for a lot of people to watch many of these hearings, because I did think, geez, there are a lot of them going on. But man, I encourage you to dip in when you can, because it's not just important, but it's also very, very interesting, sort of the inner workings. Were you going to say something? No. I mean, yes, we note that the president has put out a statement on social media, David, as you suggested, essentially saying that Ivanka Trump, his daughter, was not involved in looking at or studying election results.
and this is the quote that I think a lot of people will find interesting, she had long since checked out. That's what the president is saying. But he's very angry at his attorney general, Bill Barr, who basically towed the line up until things became so egregious that he
And I should point out that, yes, Ivanka Trump is not an elections
I'm surprised
expert.
he says, I never heard of her.
She was reacting to Bill Barr,
Right.
who said there's no fraud here.
Right.
And she said, well, you're the expert, so I went with what he said.
Right.
Which, anyways.
Yeah. As far as studying election results, I'll just note for the record that President Trump himself had an absolute legal right to full statewide recounts in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. That, of course, many people remember was done in 2016 by candidate Jill Stein. He could have requested full statewide recounts in all 3 of those states, and he requested statewide recounts in none of them. So I think that tells you a lot about his state of mind and what he believed the outcome of the election was.
David Becker, great point. Thank you so much.